the United States Gramophone Company of Washington, D.C.
Welcome to the Weird and the Beyond. Tonight we're going to be talking about the World Fair of 1893 in Chicago, Illinois. And we're going to be talking about all the beautiful, beautiful buildings that were built and then just tore down after the fair. Now, back in 1893, they just had a big fire in Chicago and it burnt the whole city down. And actually the lamp that we're burning tonight, if this was invented at the time, that would have stopped the fire. This was actually invented to protect that fire. This was an afterthought, and somebody came up with this type of oil lamp. That way if it got knocked over, it would go out. But if you don't know the story of how the Chicago fire started, supposedly a little lady was milking her cow and somehow she knocked over her oil lamp and caught her barn on fire, which caught the whole city on fire. So very interesting, and that was a crazy time. Everything was made out of wood back then, and it just burned up like you wouldn't believe. It was like kindling. So tonight I'll probably be doing 2 different videos on this, on the Chicago World Fair, because you have so much going on. You have the serial killer, you have, like I said, all the beautiful buildings, and just everything is just so much. So I doubt I'll be able to get to it all, but we're just going to be talking about a few things. One thing, guys, I want to talk about is the Ferris wheel. Here's a picture of it. It was beautiful. They, after the World Fair in Europe, they wanted to make something like the Eiffel Tower. So they built this big old Ferris wheel, and they tore it down. Now get this, you see how big this is, right? They tore it down in 1905. So it was only up like 8 or 9 years. You would think they would keep it up longer. But I was reading somewhere where in 2007 they had dug up the big old centerpiece of the Ferris wheel, and where they had just, destroyed it, it got buried there. So that was kind of interesting. But yeah, just a big old Ferris wheel. Beautiful, beautiful. And here's a little video on that, guys. We'll watch this little video together, and then we'll come back and I want to show you some of the beautiful, beautiful buildings.
Quote-unquote discovering the New World. Covering 690 acres and featuring a unified neoclassical architectural style, the fair also became known as the White City due to the color of the finishes on the buildings. And the fair was also known for its connection to possibly America's first serial killer, but that's for another video. Anyway,
there it is. My goodness, look at that thing.
A Pittsburgh bridge builder, the unique wheel stood at 264 feet. It consisted of 36 passenger cars that could hold over 2,000 people in total. 2 rotations, including getting the wheel loaded, took about 20 minutes. Tickets for the journey were 50 cents, or just over $15 in today's dollars. When the fair ended, the Ferris wheel wasn't done wowing the crowd. Although disassembled after the fair, the Ferris wheel soon was reassembled in a Chicago park. Then, in 1904, the whole thing was disassembled once more and moved to the 1904 St. Louis
Oh, I didn't know they
Exposition
moved it.
to welcome the world once again, making it the only major landmark to be part of two World's Fairs in two different locations. Sadly, following the St. Louis Fair, the wheel was demolished and sold for scrap.
Oh,
Although
man.
that original Ferris wheel is long gone, many wheels borrowing the Ferris wheel name sprung up at fairs and amusement parks around the world. And today, the giant wheel concept is back in places like London, Orlando, and Las Vegas. And Dubai is home to the largest wheel to date, towering over 820 feet.
Phew.
We just brushed the surface of the history of the Ferris wheel, so be sure to check out the link in our description.
Man, that's
to learn
cool.
more.
Yeah. Ain't that, wasn't it? It's just beautiful. I don't know why they tore that thing down so quick. You would think they would kept it up, and they could have made a lot of money on that. You know, paying people paying to ride it. But now, guys, I want to watch this video here, and it kind of tells a little bit about the World Fair and stuff, and we'll get a little bit more insight. Now, on these buildings, guys, like I said, and they said there was like thousands and thousands of people came worldwide. So I guess they all brought airships, because we didn't have. I have to check. I can't remember when the Wright brothers made the first flight, but I don't believe they had a big enough. If even they had a plane, I don't think they had a big enough plane to bring people over here. So they either brought ship or air. Those big old airships, blimps. So, but yeah, it's just, I find it so fascinating that they built all these buildings within a year. I mean, they even had Little Italy there. I mean, we'll probably see a little bit in the video on how, you know, they had those little canals and those boats, and it was just, it's crazy how they did this. I wish I could go back in time, which we all do, but wouldn't it be great to go back in time and just see how they did this? Because today these buildings are just about as mistress as the pyramids to me. You know, I'm like, how did they do it in such short time? And then they tore them down. It just blows my mind, guys. Alrighty, here's a video, guys, on it, on the 1893 Chicago World Fair.
Were exhibited, and the fair would become forever linked with a serial killer. This is the incredible story of the 1893 World's Fair. The 1893 World's Fair was considered a remarkable achievement, not least because it took place just 22 years after Chicago was gutted by fire. Between October 8th and 10th, 1871, a huge inferno ripped through the mostly wooden city. National Geographic reports that an estimated 300 people were killed and 17,500 structures were destroyed. The cost of the damage was around $200 million. With 90,000 of the city's 324,000 residents now homeless, looting broke out. Martial law was also declared on October 11th and lasted for several weeks. However, Chicago's leaders saw an opportunity to rebuild a bigger, better, more fireproof city. Fortunately, the railroads and meat plants, Chicago's main industries, were still intact. New laws required buildings to be constructed of fireproof materials, although it took another smaller fire in 1874 to convince architects and builders to take these measures seriously. In 1890, Chicago beat rivals New York, Washington, D.C., and St. Louis in the contest to host the 1893 World's Fair. The city ultimately raised more money than its rivals, from wealthy investors including Marshall Field, the city and state, and ordinary citizens. The organizers' first priority was designing and constructing the landscape that the fair would take place upon. For this, they hired America's most famous landscape artist, Frederick Law Olmsted, and his business partner, Harry Codman, who sadly died before he could see their plans come to fruition. The fair organized their design around a series of artificial lagoons and waterways, complete with artificial islands. One of the main attractions was the Basin, a huge pond in the Court of Honor, which featured the 65-foot gold-gilded statue of the Republic, a robed woman holding a globe and a staff. Guests could travel between exhibits by traditional Venetian-style gondolas or on newfangled electric-powered boats. Several boats also served as attractions in their own right. The Viking was a traditional Viking ship that was built in Norway and sailed across the Atlantic to New York, then on to Chicago. PBS reports that there was also a Japanese dragon boat and replicas of Columbus's 3 ships. Olmsted took special pride in the fair's gardens, and one country in particular benefited from his obsession. The Japanese pavilion stood on the wooded island, looking out on a small garden known as the Japanese or Osaka Garden, complete with cherry trees. The fair's organizers appointed legendary Chicago architect Daniel Burnham as chief of construction, and he assembled the Avengers of 19th century American architects. Ironically, for a fair that was supposed to celebrate American achievements, they agreed on the European neoclassical style for the exposition's main focal point, the Court of Honor. This was made up of enormous halls that hosted the exhibitions deemed most exemplary. These included the Machinery Hall, the Architectural Building, and the Manufacturers and Liberal Arts Building. All the buildings were painted white, hence they were collectively referred to as the White City. As beautiful as the buildings were, they were only designed to be temporary. Most were made from a mixture of plaster, cement, and a fibrous material called staff. But even after the fair had been dismantled, the legacy of the White City continued. It led to a renewed interest in neoclassical architecture, and it may have influenced the creation of another equally imaginative place. According to the Chicago Tribune, the dazzling achievements of the White City potentially inspired Wizard of Oz author and Chicago resident L. Frank Baum to create the book's Emerald City. The 1889 Paris World's Fair had shown off electric lighting, but the 1893 exposition took the electric revolution to the next level. Most Americans had still never encountered this seemingly magical technology before, and they got a dramatic introduction. At the fair's opening on May 1st, President Grover Cleveland pushed a button and the electrical power turned on. Grover Cleveland spanked me on 2 non-consecutive occasions! Hundreds of thousands of lights illuminated the buildings of the White City. It was the first World's Fair lit solely by electricity, but the spectacle went even further than that. The whole exhibition hall was dedicated to electricity. Guests could witness innovations such as electric sewing machines, irons, laundry machines, an early fax machine, and electric chairs. There was also the world's first moving sidewalk, the predecessor of the ones used in airports today. All this electricity was provided by one of history nerds' favorite inventors. Yes, the 1893 exposition is part of Nikola Tesla's unbelievable real-life story. Wow. Tesla sold his patents for an electrical system based on AC current to George Westinghouse. Westinghouse used them to undercut rival Thomas Edison's General Electric Company and win the bid to supply electricity to the exposition. But Edison still had a presence at the fair. It was the first time many visitors ever saw a light bulb, and he showed off his kinetoscope, an early device showing moving pictures. Although World's Fairs were supposed to unite people from different countries, there were also opportunities to show off what your city and country was capable of, kind of like the Olympics. Chief of Construction Daniel Burnham was especially keen to outdo the 1889 Paris World's Fair, which had unveiled one of the most iconic structures of all time, the Eiffel Tower. He got his answer from a structural engineer named George Washington Gale Ferris Jr. Ferris's original job at the fair was inspecting steel, but after learning that Burnham was looking for a centerpiece, he presented his idea for an enormous wheel spinning on a central axle. This was no carnival attraction. According to the Chicago Architecture Center, it stood 264 feet tall, with 36 gondolas around its outer edge, each able to hold 60 people, thus carrying a total of 2,160 riders at a time. Burnham was skeptical, and Ferris spent his own money running safety tests. Eventually, he succeeded in convincing Burnham, and the Ferris wheel became one of the exposition's main attractions, with approximately 1.4 million visitors paying the 50-cent fee to ride. I would really like to take you there. Fred, do you mind? The 1893 World's Fair was the backdrop for one of America's most notorious serial killers. H.H. Holmes came to Chicago around 1885 and started working in a pharmacy in Englewood, eventually taking it over. He had a building constructed nearby on 63rd Street, which he ran as a hotel during the fair. Later dubbed the Murder Castle, Harper's reported in 1943 that it contained secret passageways, staircases that led nowhere, rooms with no doors, gas fixtures that led into bedrooms, and a kiln in the basement. Guests and employees got lost in the dark maze, and Holmes would torture them, kill them, and dismember or burn their bodies in the basement. Many historians now believe that stories about Holmes and the Murder Castle were exaggerated by the press at the time until they became myth. That said, there is strong evidence that Holmes did murder multiple people, including children, as part of his many insurance scams. Estimates range from 9 to 200, and at one point he confessed to 27, but some of those supposed victims were still alive. According to Harper's, Holmes was caught in November 1894 after murdering a longtime associate to claim the insurance. He was hung in Philadelphia in 1896 for that murder, although a conspiracy theory that he escaped led to his body being exhumed in 2017. Rolling Stone reported that tests confirmed it was indeed Holmes. World's fairs showed off the latest innovations from around the globe in a variety of industries, and some famous products today tie their histories to the 1893 World's Fair, correctly or not. A common story has Cracker Jack being introduced at the fair by two German brothers, but according to NPR, it's possible that the popular 1908 song Take Me Out to the Ball Game, which name drops the brand, was actually responsible for its success. Similarly, Pabst Blue Ribbon did not win its titular prize at the 1893 World's Fair, although the brewery did take home the award for best beer. Another product supposedly introduced at the fair was Wrigley's Juicy Fruit Chewing Gum. William Wrigley created the flavor in 1893. He had a concession stand at the fair, so it's possible. Meanwhile, Austrian-Hungarian brothers-in-law Emil Reichel and Samuel Ladani had such success selling their Vienna sausages that they started the Vienna Sausage Company, which still dominates hot dog stands today. African-American leaders had hoped to use the 1893 World's Fair to show what black people had achieved in just 3 decades since the Emancipation Proclamation began the end of slavery. But while all 44 states at the time were represented, along with many other countries, the organizers refused to let African-Americans exhibit as a collective group. They were also excluded from organizing committees and the opening ceremony, and black women were rejected from participating in the women's building. But some black leaders still found ways to make their voices heard, literally. If you know the crazy real-life story of Frederick Douglass, you know he wasn't easily deterred. Douglass was invited to represent Haiti at the fair, and he used the ceremony to make a speech condemning American racism during the fair's dedication ceremony. When the fair opened, he and fellow civil rights legend Ida B. Wells and 2 other activists wrote and handed out a pamphlet on the same theme. The organizers made one capitulation. They deemed August 25th a day for celebrating African-American achievements. Douglass was set to give another speech. However, when someone in the crowd heckled him about, quote, the Negro problem, he tossed his notes and delivered a blistering on-the-spot rebuke. Although African Americans were not allowed to represent themselves, black and indigenous people from other countries had their own exhibits. But in some ways, these may have been worse than having no representation. The exhibits were excluded from the Grand Court of Honor. Instead, they were housed on the Midway Plassing, the entertainment strip. That's housed in the literal sense. The exposition became a temporary home for people representing some Native American tribe and from people from Dahomey in West Africa. As page 54 of the official guide to the fair put it, the idea was that visitors could watch them cook, make trinkets, perform their songs and dances, and go about the ordinary routine of life in their tribes. They were treated more like animals in a zoo. The literature and media that came out of the fair endorsed this twisted perspective through racist cartoons and descriptions. They also associated African Americans with what they saw as the primitive Dahomeans, something Frederick Douglass condemned in his speeches and pamphlets. Fortunately, 2 of the buildings constructed for the 1893 World's Fair are still in use today. The first building is the Palace of Fine Arts, which was built specifically to be fireproof. It was used to display works of art from all around the world during the fair. After the fair, the building became the Field Museum, housing natural history artifacts. In 1921, the museum moved to its current location on Lakeshore Drive. The building stood empty until a restoration project started in 1926 prepared it to become the Museum of Science and Industry, just in time for Chicago's next World Fair, the 1933-34 Century of Progress. It's still there. The current entrance was the back during the fair. The other building may be more familiar. It's one of the things in Ferris Bueller's Day Off you only notice as an adult. Bueller. While most of the World's Fair took place on the south side of Chicago in Jackson Park, the World's Congress building was downtown. It hosted the World's Congress Auxiliary, a series of meetings on the social topics of the day. Afterwards, it was taken over by the Art Institute of Chicago, which had partly funded its construction. We can't visit the 1893 World's Fair, but thankfully we can retread the visitors' footsteps in these beautiful buildings. Check out one of our newest videos right here, plus even more grunge videos about.
Man, that was great. I love looking at the old buildings. Alrighty, guys. Until the next Weird and Beyond, you guys stay safe. And if the door creaks and the windows shutter and the lights flicker, run hard. Bye, guys.